They never left the house, but the house has left its mark on the town. In the town of New Carthage, the Abernathy bloodline was spoken of only in hushed prayers, until even the priests refused to say their names. It began with a covenant, and ended with a locked room no one would enter. The last child was born without eyes. They said it was mercy. This is not just a history, it's a confession, one written in blood and sacrament. You are watching what remained after the light of God was turned away. The forest was not silent, but it felt like it was listening. The wind moved between the pines like breath through hollow teeth. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the soil was already brittle, blackened from long frost and early death. A narrow trail worn by cartwheels and prayers cut through the woods of what would one day be called New Carthage. But in 1734, it had no name, only a presence dot, and at the end of that trail stood a man, Nathaniel Abernathy, 47 years old, Welsh-born, broad hands marked by scripture ink and blacksmith ash. His wife had died crossing the sea. His youngest child was buried before they left port. And yet, when he stepped onto the clearing beneath the trembling trees, Nathaniel fell to his knees and smiled. He said he'd been told to build, not by the land, not by the governor, but by something holy. His journal survives, hidden behind a false panel in the family Bible, preserved in wax and linen. The Lord has shown me the blueprints, 7 rooms, 7 altars, 1 chamber that is not to be opened until the season of clearing. He said, "My covenant shall be built in wood, but sealed in blood." The house was raised with strange precision, not square to the land, but to the stars. Carpenters from the surrounding towns were paid in silver, not shillings. No nails were used, only dovetail joints, wooden pegs, animal glue that stank of rot. Locals noticed. They came to help once, but no one returned a second time. The Reverend Clark from Boston visited the site in early autumn. He was tasked with blessing the property. He was never seen again. His carriage was found in the shallows of the Haverhill River, split open like a gutted deer. His robes folded neatly on the rocks. Nathaniel claimed he had left early. No one pressed further. By winter, the house stood, 7 rooms, exactly as described, each facing a cardinal direction, each with a narrow window that only sunlight could enter, but never moonlight. There were no hearths, no chimneys, no cellar. But the most curious detail came from a builder who broke contract before completion. His name was Joseph Carroll. He was 19. He later confessed, while dying of fever in a Salem poorhouse, that the center of the house did not match the rest, that it was built downward. There was a room we weren't allowed to measure. No door, no handle, just a square of wood sealed with iron nails. And it hummed. The Abernathys moved in on December 7th, 1734. Nathaniel, his 2 remaining children, Elias, age 14, Martha, age 11, and a single traveling midwife named Maeve, who had vanished 3 months later, though her shoes were found in the attic still tied. Inside, the home was strangely bare. The furniture was hand-built, unvarnished. No portraits, no mirrors, no crosses, but there were altars. 7 in total, 1 in each room, each carved from dark cedar, stained not with paint, but something thicker. And upon each altar, a candle, unlit, unmelted, always cold to the touch. The family held services every 3rd night. No one outside the house was permitted. No one inside was seen in daylight. Neighbors complained of chanting. Low, measured, repetitive. One said it sounded like a Latin mass. Another insisted it wasn't Latin at all, but older. Mouths formed around vowels that didn't belong in human speech. But nothing was done. The region was vast, authority scarce. The church had other matters, and the Abernathys kept to themselves, except when they didn't. In 1736, 2 children went missing, siblings, 8 and 10. They were last seen picking crab apples near the southern boundary of the Abernathy land. Their mother, Ruth Hensley, claimed to hear knocking at her door each night for 7 days, always at the same time, 3:07 a.m. On the 8th night, the knocking stopped. The next morning, a parcel was found on the edge of her garden. Inside was a single crabapple. It had been carved with tiny childlike fingernails. Ruth left town by horseback. She never returned. Her house burned 2 weeks later, and so the rumors began. Whispers in church pews, scratched letters between midwives, superstition wrapped in silk prayer. It wasn't Christianity. It wasn't Protestant. It wasn't Catholic. It wasn't any form the colonies had seen. It was something older, something with the rhythm of liturgy, but none of the salvation. Those who entered the Abernathy home described a stillness that felt held in place. Air thick like paste, dust that didn't fall but clung. And always the feeling of being watched, not from across the room, but from beneath it. One guest, a Scottish trader named Lennox, spoke of hearing what he believed was a child behind the wall, whispering. The voice repeated a single line, slowly, rhythmically. "We are already forgiven. We are already forgiven. We are already forgiven." He left before dawn. He died of fever crossing the Merrimack. He scratched something into the side of his cart with a blade. Not God. In 1739, the town pastor Thomas Bell delivered a sermon condemning the Abernathys by name. He claimed their covenant was false, that no blood pact ever pleased the Lord, that no altar, no matter how pure, could replace a true cross. He was found 4 days later, floating in his own well. The body was dry. The water was gone. And still, the family remained. Nathaniel Abernathy died in his sleep in 1741. No illness, no struggle, only one final entry in his journal. The door will open in the season of clearing. He was buried beneath the house. No stone. No prayer. No sound, except the wind through the trees. And something beneath it, moving, patient. Waiting. For the door. To open. The mist doesn't rise from Sable Hill. It hangs there motionless, suspended, as if waiting to be told where to go. Even in the summer, the land around the house remained cool to the touch. Grass never grew past the ankle. Trees bent away from the clearing, their branches reaching back toward the forest, as if pulled by something they didn't want to see. The house itself had darkened. What once was pale, sanded timber now absorbed light. The cedar siding, once clean and fragrant, became thick with oils. At night, it looked wet. By 1742, a year after Nathaniel Abernathy's death, the house was no longer a structure. It was a presence. Something lived in its shape, and those who spoke of it referred to it not as the Abernathy house, but as the house on Sable Hill, a place separate from family, from history, even from land. It was not just a home. It had been consecrated, but not by clergy, not by God. The first accounts of ritual came from a former apprentice of Nathaniel's, Edgar Fisk, who claimed he had once been invited to dine with the family. What he found was not a meal. It was a table of empty bowls, and 3 children with raw lips seated silently before a single unlit candle. Nathaniel had been dead for over a year, but his portrait hung above the altar, and a voice, Edgar swore, was reading from a text behind the walls. Latin, spoken slowly, almost sung, each syllable followed by the sound of dripping water. He left that night with bleeding gums. He would never speak of what he heard in the hall, only this: they weren't praying, they were listening. It became a pattern. The family withdrew. Supplies were delivered, never requested. Letters from relatives went unanswered. Visitors were refused, then warned. Eventually, no one tried. For 40 years, no one, not one neighbor, not one merchant, not one curious traveler crossed the threshold of the house on Sable Hill and returned, except for the clergy, and even they didn't return whole. The first was Father Matthias Crane, sent by the Bishop of Essex in 1747 to investigate rumors of spiritual corruption. He was methodical, educated, sober in his judgments. His final letter, dated April 6, 1747, was found in the folds of his traveling vestments. They sing before they eat. They fast before they bleed. I found a child in the south room. His eyes were closed, but I could tell he was awake. They call it cleansing, but I can smell meat in the chapel. It is not animal. It is not animal. His horse returned without him, covered in a dried black substance that would not wash away. Later that year, the church sent no one. They claimed there was a flood, a misfiled record, illness among the priests. But the truth was simpler. They were afraid, and they had reason. In 1751, an apothecary's assistant named Miriam found a package in her yard. It was wrapped in twine and rough cloth. Inside were two items: a human molar, too small for an adult, and a page from a prayer book torn, water damaged, and rewritten in charcoal. Each Latin phrase was distorted, mirrored in places, fragmented. In others, the only recognizable line was at the bottom: Dolum intrit, Fames Manet. It enters the house. Hunger remains. By the late 1750s, townspeople stopped referring to the family by name. They were simply them now, those on the hill. It was said the Abernathy children never left past the age of 5. That once their first fast was completed, their feet never touched another road. They learned to walk the house like a labyrinth: 7 rooms, 7 rites, 1 silence between each. Local lore claimed they were taught to bleed by the moon, sleep without breath, and fast for 7 days without speaking. And when they did speak, it was in the voice of someone else. None of this was ever confirmed, but the effect was real. Midwives moved away. Pastors skipped their circuit visits. Even the tax collector crossed himself as he bypassed the hill. No one wanted to see inside, but one did. A man named Thomas Reeve, a civil steward from Concord. He arrived in spring 1762. His journal remains. The house is still. It makes no sound, no birds, no insects. It is as if the hill has been taken out of time. I knocked. The door opened without touch. I did not step in. I did not dare. He writes of hearing a hymn, soft, repeating, but not sung. Whispered. He describes seeing a boy in the far room, standing still, eyes open, arms raised, and on the wall behind him 7 symbols, burned into the wood, not carved, burned. Each was shaped like a cross, but with broken limbs. Thomas did not enter. He turned. He fled. He returned to Concord pale and mumbling, fingers stained red from something he wouldn't describe. He died 6 months later from infection. His final word, recorded by his nurse, was simply, hungry. Years passed. The house was never abandoned. Each new generation of Abernathys appeared at birth and disappeared in youth, absorbed by the structure like breath in cold glass. They were born. They were named. They were gone. One woman, Louisa Abernathy, was known only through census, never seen in town, never baptized, never married, but her signature appears on the margins of the Doctrina Secreta, a text found in 1794 beneath the floorboards of a chapel 200 miles away. She had rewritten 3 psalms. Each replaced the word God with it. It comforts me. It anoints my head with oil. I shall dwell in the house of it forever. There is no further record of Louisa. And by 1770, it became clear the house was not just inhabited. It was obeyed. Even among whispers, there were rules. Children were not to play near the northern fence. No metal was to be carried beyond the hill's base. And under no circumstance was salt to be spilled near the property. One man forgot. A mason named Cal Redding, while repairing a collapsed wall near the boundary line, he dropped his lunch. A salted leg of pork. He laughed, picked it up, ate anyway. That night, he walked into the woods barefoot and was found 3 days later alive, but mute, hands chewed to the bone. He had scratched a message into a birch tree. No more meat, only light. By the turn of the century, the Abernathy house was a known thing, not a myth, not a haunted place, but a constant, unchanging, untouched. And every year, once in spring and once again in winter, a thin column of smoke would rise from the house, always at dusk, always for exactly 7 minutes. and then nothing. Silence. Like something had been fed. Or forgiven. But something wasn't right, because one spring, the smoke didn't come. And when the townspeople saw no light from the hill, no flicker from the chapel window, no sound from the southern gate, they realized something they'd never considered, that it wasn't the rituals that had kept the house still. It was the people inside them. And now, they weren't performing them anymore. The fields died first, then the trees. Then the animals stopped making sound. By the spring of 1780, New Carthage was starving. Rain hadn't come in nearly 7 months. The soil, once rich and black, had turned to fine gray powder. Wheat collapsed in its stalks. Root vegetables rotted before they could grow. Cows gave no milk. Chickens lay still under empty nests, heads tucked into feathers like they'd forgotten what sunlight meant. The air was dry, but the sickness wasn't drought. It was something else. People began to whisper about punishment. That sin had collected in the corners of the town like dust, and God had finally noticed. A preacher from Exeter rode into the center square and nailed a Bible to the courthouse door. It was open to Psalms. They shall be consumed, but the righteous shall be fed. But not everyone was starving. Atop Sable Hill, the Abernathys thrived. Eyewitnesses reported lantern light flickering in every window. Their livestock, still lean, still alive, wandered the slope in tight, watchful patterns. Barrels were delivered down the hill in the dead of night. Thick linen cloths stretched over their tops, stained dark, stitched tight. No one asked questions, because no one wanted to be invited inside. And at night, they sang every midnight for 7 minutes. Voices could be heard from the chapel window of the house on Sable Hill. Not loud, not chaotic, but melodic, calm, rhythmically even, like the pacing of breath in a hospital bed. One farmer, Jedediah Marsh, described it this way. It weren't church music, not like you'd hear on a Sunday. It was ... thinner, like the words were stretched too far. I heard Hosanna, but it had too many syllables, and they always stopped on the same note, one that didn't feel finished. The townsfolk started calling it the Songs of Hunger, because every time they sang, someone below the hill would lose a little more of their crops, of their livestock, of their strength. And then, eventually, of their family. Mrs. Blythe, a seamstress who lived near the river, was the first to speak openly. She claimed she woke up one night to find her 5-year-old daughter, Eliza, standing at the foot of her bed. Her eyes were open, she was smiling, and she was whispering, "It's not so bad, Mama. They told me how not to feel hungry anymore." Eliza had never been to the hill, but the next morning, she was gone. No footprints, no forced door, no sign of struggle. Just her doll propped upright on the windowsill facing the hill. 2 days later, the town council sent a letter to the local diocese. They asked for a visitation. Quiet, discreet, there was no mention of heresy. Only concern. The church agreed. A young priest named Father Simon Halberd arrived by cart on July 3rd, 28 years old, scholarly, earnest, fresh from his training in Boston. His assignment was to observe and record. He stayed in New Carthage for 4 days. His journal entries recovered years later from beneath a loose floorboard in the vestry are the only remaining record of his visit. July 3rd, the townspeople speak of hunger as if it were a spirit. They are afraid to use the word curse, but they are not afraid to say Abernathy. July 4, I walked to the base of the hill, did not approach the home, saw a girl in the upper window. She was watching me. Still, no movement. I waved. She did not blink. July 5th, attended a vigil for a missing boy. Mother could not speak. The candle she held was shaking. Not from wind. There was no wind. His final entry is dated July 6th. I made it to the chapel, not inside, just to the steps. The air smelled like copper and turnips. The doors were ajar. I heard them singing, not the family. The walls. That was the last time anyone saw Father Halberd alive. 2 weeks later, His cart was found abandoned at the edge of Sable Hill. The reins had been cut. The horse was never found. Inside the cart, his SATCHEL. Inside the satchel, the journal, torn at the final page, and a wooden crucifix snapped clean in half. And that's when they stopped asking the church for help. Instead, a town began to turn inward. Locks were added to every door. Children were forbidden outside after dusk. The butcher hung garlic, not for preservation, but for protection. And every time a family went missing, the rest simply lit candles and waited. But the Abernathys were never questioned. Not directly, because they had never claimed guilt. They didn't have to. Their silence said everything. And still, they continued to thrive. One visitor, an itinerant mapmaker named William Crane, passed through New Carthage that autumn. He was unaware of the history and had no reason to avoid the hill. He climbed it during daylight, under the pretense of recording topography. What he saw changed him. He returned shaken, sunburned, and with a single page of notes. The hill is wrong. It's convex, not concave. Like something underneath is pushing up. The house doesn't cast shadows in the right direction. I counted 7 windows facing west, but the structure only has 6 rooms. He left that same night, not before speaking briefly to the town's blacksmith. The children don't blink, he whispered. They don't even look. They remember. By the end of 1780, famine had worsened. Over 33 residents of New Carthage had perished. 16 more had vanished, but no member of the Abernathy family was ever seen visiting the market, requesting assistance, or asking for prayer. And on the coldest night of the year, December 21st, candles were seen in all 7 windows for exactly 7 minutes. And the singing returned, but this time it was louder. Lower. Almost. Reverend. Something else. It wasn't a hymn. It was a thanksgiving, a celebration of full bellies, full throats. While the town below shivered, bent, and wept, a final note was made by the midwife Ruth Ann Wallace in a letter she never sent. The children are not sick. They are not missing. They are not dead. They are part of it now, part of the house. We don't feed it. We never did. It feeds itself. The letter ends mid-sentence. It was found in her stove, partially burned. Only one line remained fully legible. They never blink because they're always watching the inside of their own eyes. And the hunger didn't end. It simply stopped being noticed. In the northern wing of the house, the wallpaper never curled. The wood there remained warm, even in winter. Dust never settled on the sills, and the curtains never moved, no matter how strong the wind outside. It was said the rooms had been prepared long before the daughters were born. All 3 of them. Clara, Lenra, and the youngest Abigail. There were no birth records. No baptismal entries. No mention in the church ledgers or town census. But everyone knew when they had arrived, because the house grew quiet, even quieter than usual. Neighbors reported a sudden stillness on Sable Hill. The candles stopped flickering. The chanting ceased. The chapel windows were shuttered. And then, weeks later, townspeople heard lullabies. Soft, off-key, sung not in any familiar language, but something close to it, like nursery rhymes translated too many times, then whispered backward through the keyhole. No one remembered seeing the girls until they were nearly grown, but when they were seen, they were seen. All 3 walked together, pale, barefoot, each one with identical white ribbons tied around their necks, knotted not in bows but tight, flat loops like something holding them closed. They never spoke, not once. A merchant passing through town claimed to have seen them at the base of the hill. They had stood in the middle of the path, perfectly still. As he approached, he tipped his hat. They stared. He coughed, said good day. They turned together without cue and walked back into the trees. He described their footsteps as quiet, but not soft, like they weren't walking on the ground. But through it. Another witness, an old schoolteacher named Martha Peam, claimed to have heard laughter once. Just once. She had walked past the house at dusk, The windows were open, windless. From inside, she heard 3 voices. In unison, laughing, not joyous, not cruel, just repeating the same breathless chuckle, again and again, until it stopped. Suddenly, and then nothing. She left her post 2 weeks later, told the town council she had gone deaf in one ear, but no doctor could find cause. She was buried. 2 years later, her left ear was found packed with wool and broken glass, but the daughters remained, and they aged, gracefully, quietly, until marriage came calling. No one knows how the proposals were arranged. There were no dances, no courtships, no parental introductions, but within the span of one summer, 3 men were engaged to the Abernathy sisters. One was a carpenter, one a traveling violinist, one the son of a deacon. Their names were remembered only in fragments. Samuel, Elias, Daniel. They each arrived on the hill on separate weeks. They each entered the house, and none were seen leaving. Not at first. It was Samuel who married Clara first. The service was small, no officiant, only the family. Witnesses claimed they heard a bell from the chapel and saw 3 figures emerge afterward, 2 standing. One slumped. The next morning, Samuel was seen chopping firewood behind the southern fence, smiling, bleeding from the knuckles, singing without words. But something wasn't right. He had a rope around his waist. It led back into the house. As if he wasn't allowed too far. 1 week later, he vanished. No explanation. Just gone. The woodpile was left mid-swing, the axe buried. In the stump. Clara stood on the porch, still barefoot, still silent, staring at nothing. Elias married Lenora next. He lasted longer, nearly 3 weeks. He was last seen entering the chapel with 2 candles and a covered bowl. Witnesses described a low sound coming from inside. Not music. Breathing. When they checked the chapel the next day, Elias was gone. No sign of struggle, just the bowl still warm. Inside, wood ash and what appeared to be fragments of cloth. 1 piece was lace. Lenora never appeared at the window. Again. And then came Daniel, Abigail's groom. He was the most vocal of the 3, unsettled by the silence. Nervous during his stay, he was seen writing letters, asking questions. Some of those letters survive. One of them reads, "They do not speak, even at night. I tried to hold her hand. It was cold. She did not look at me, but I felt her looking anyway. I think the chapel is where it starts, but I don't think it ends there." He married Abigail in the last week of October. 2 nights later, the chapel bell rang 7 times, and that's when they found him. Inside. Laid across the altar like an offering. Eyes gouged, tongue removed, a fine dust, later identified as wood. Ash packed into the back of his throat. The sheriff sealed the chapel, told the townspeople it was a hunting accident, but no one believed it, because everyone knew what the Abernathy daughters were by then. They were not wives, they were vessels. For what? No one could say, but every man who came too close left less than a whole. And so the hill grew quiet again. Clara was seen walking the eastern path. Alone. Lenora stood in the river for nearly 2 hours one dusk, unmoving, until the water turned black around her feet. Abigail never left the house again, and the windows were shuttered. Until the night of the eclipse. A red moon, cold wind. And 7 candles in the chapel. That was the last time anyone saw the daughters. No graves, no farewells. Only silence. And when spring came, the trees on Sable Hill bloomed white, but not with blossoms, with cloth, torn, ribbons. Dozens of them. Each tied to the branches. Flat, tight, closed. The rain didn't touch the windows of St. Lyle's parish that autumn. It slid down the glass in perfect lines, but never left a trace, as though the chapel had been removed from the storm, preserved or protected. Inside, the air was still, almost too still. Father Benedict Albinus was known for his silence. He rarely spoke during Mass, rarely wrote sermons. He believed presence was enough. That stillness was a form of prayer. But on October 2nd, 1803, he broke that silence and asked to be sent to Sable Hill. No one volunteered him. No one suggested it. But he arrived at the archdiocese that morning with a suitcase, a flask of water, and a small crucifix carved from river bone. He placed it on the bishop's desk and said, "I have been called." He did not mean by the Abernathy's, and he did not mean by God. The official record of his visitation was lost in the fire that consumed the Essex archives in 1819, but 4 letters survived, each sealed with wax, hidden behind a false panel in his study desk, discovered almost 50 years later. After his death, the first letter is dated the night before his journey. "I have dreamt of corridors that loop, not physically, but morally. Every step forward feels earned, but each turn brings me back to my own reflection. I believe I am being watched by the self I have not yet become, and I do not like what I see." He arrived at Sable Hill at sunrise. The ground was damp. The grass snapped beneath his boots like straw. No smoke came from the chimney. No birds moved above the roofline. But the door was open, just a crack, not enough to invite, just enough to see that someone was already waiting. The Abernathys did not greet him, not in the usual sense. He stepped inside and was met with silence, protection, and every time a family went missing, the rest simply lit candles and waited. But the Abernathys were never questioned. Not directly, because they had never claimed guilt. They didn't have to. Their silence said everything. And still, they continued to thrive. One visitor, an itinerant mapmaker named William Crane, passed through New Carthage that autumn. He was unaware of the history and had no reason to avoid the hill. He climbed it during daylight, under the pretense of recording topography. What he saw changed him. He returned shaken, sunburned, and with a single page of notes. "The hill is wrong. It's convex, not concave. Like something underneath is pushing up. The house doesn't cast shadows in the right direction. I counted 7 windows facing west, but the structure only has 6 rooms." He left that same night, not before speaking briefly to the town's blacksmith. "The children don't blink," he whispered. "They don't even look. They remember." By the end of 1780, famine had worsened. Over 33 residents of New Carthage had perished. 16 more had vanished, but no member of the Abernathy family was ever seen visiting the market, requesting assistance, or asking for prayer. And on the coldest night of the year, December 21st, candles were seen in all 7 windows for exactly 7 minutes, and the singing returned. But this time, it was louder. Lower. Almost. Reverend. Something else. It wasn't a hymn. It was a thanksgiving, a celebration of full bellies, full throats. While the town below shivered, bent, and wept, a final note was made by the midwife Ruth Ann Wallace in a letter she never sent. "The children are not sick. They are not missing. They are not dead. They are part of it now, part of the house. We don't feed it. We never did. It feeds itself." The letter ends mid-sentence. "It was found in her stove, partially burned. Only one line remained fully legible. They never blink because they're always watching the inside of their own eyes. And the hunger didn't end. It simply stopped being noticed. In the northern wing of the house, the wallpaper never curled. The wood there remained warm, even in winter. Dust never settled on the sills, and the curtains never moved, no matter how strong the wind outside. It was said the rooms had been prepared long before the daughters were born. All 3 of them. Clara, Lenra, and the youngest Abigail. There were no birth records. No baptismal entries. No mention in the church ledgers or town census. But everyone knew when they had arrived, because the house grew quiet, even quieter than usual. Neighbors reported a sudden stillness on Sable Hill. The candles stopped flickering. The chanting ceased. The chapel windows were shuttered. And then, weeks later, townspeople heard lullabies. Soft, off-key, song not in any familiar language, but something close to it like nursery rhymes translated too many times, then whispered backward through. The keyhole dot. No one remembered seeing the girls until they were nearly grown, but when they were seen dot. All three walked together, pale, barefoot, each one with identical white ribbons tied around their necks, knotted not in bows but tight, flat loops like something holding them closed. They never spoke, not once. A merchant passing through town claimed to have seen them at the base of the hill. They had stood in the middle of the path, perfectly still. As he approached, he tipped his hat. They stared. He coughed, said good day. They turned together, without cue, and walked back into the trees. He described their footsteps as quiet, but not soft, like they weren't walking on the ground. But through it got another witness. An old school teacher named Martha Peam claimed to have heard laughter once. Just once. She had walked past the house at dusk. The windows were open, windless. From inside, she heard three voices, in unison. Laughing. Not joyous, not cruel, just repeating the same breathless chuckle, again and again, until it stopped. Suddenly. And then nothing. She left her post 2 weeks later, told the town council she had gone deaf in one ear, but no doctor could find cause. She was buried. 2 years later, her left ear was found packed with wool and broken glass, but the daughters remained, and they aged, gracefully, quietly, until marriage came calling. No one knows how the proposals were arranged. There were no dances, no courtships, no parental introductions. But within the span of one summer, 3 men were engaged to the Abernathy sisters. One was a carpenter, one a traveling violinist, one the son of a deacon. Their names were remembered only in fragments. Samuel, Elias, Daniel. They each arrived on the hill on separate weeks. They each entered the house, and none were seen leaving. Not at first. It was Samuel who married Clara first. The service was small, no officiant, only the family. Witnesses claimed they heard a bell from the chapel and saw 3 figures emerge afterward, 2 standing, 1 slumped. The next morning, Samuel was seen chopping firewood behind the southern fence, smiling, bleeding from the knuckles, singing without words. But something wasn't right. He had a rope around his waist. It led back into the house. As if he wasn't allowed too far. 1 week later, he vanished. No explanation. Just gone. The woodpile was left mid-swing, the axe buried. In the stump. Clara stood on the porch, still barefoot, still silent, staring at nothing. Elias married. Lenora next. He lasted longer, nearly 3 weeks. He was last seen entering the chapel with 2 candles and a covered bowl. Witnesses described a low sound coming from inside. Not music. Breathing. When they checked the chapel the next day, Elias was gone. No sign of struggle, just the bowl still warm. Inside, wood ash and what appeared to be fragments of cloth. 1 piece was lace. Lenora never appeared at the window. Again. And then came Daniel, Abigail's groom. He was the most vocal of the 3, unsettled by the silence. Nervous during his stay, he was seen writing letters, asking questions. Some of those letters survive. One of them reads, "They do not speak, even at night. I tried to hold her hand. It was cold. She did not look at me, but I felt her looking anyway. I think the chapel is where it starts, but I don't think it ends there." He married Abigail in the last week of October. 2 nights later, the chapel bell rang 7 times, and that's when they found him. Inside. Laid across the altar like an offering. Eyes gouged, tongue removed, a fine dust, later identified as wood. Ash packed into the back of his throat. The sheriff sealed the chapel, told the townspeople it was a hunting accident, but no one believed it, because everyone knew what the Abernathy daughters were by then. They were not wives, they were vessels. For what? No one could say, but every man who came too close left less than a whole. And so the hill grew quiet again. Clara was seen walking the eastern path. Alone. Lenora stood in the river for nearly 2 hours one dusk, unmoving, until the water turned black around her feet. Abigail never left the house again, and the windows were shuttered until the night of the eclipse. A red moon, cold wind and 7 candles in the chapel. That was the last time anyone saw the daughters. No graves, no farewells. Only silence. And when spring came, the trees on Sable Hill bloomed white, but not with blossoms, with cloth, torn, ribbons. Dozens of them, each tied to the branches. Flat, tight, closed. The rain didn't touch the windows of St. Lyle's parish that autumn. It slid down the glass in perfect lines, but never left a trace, as though the chapel had been removed from the storm, preserved or protected. Inside, the air was still, almost too still. Father Benedict Albinus was known for his silence. He rarely spoke during Mass, rarely wrote sermons. He believed presence was enough. That stillness was a form of prayer. But on October 2nd, 1803, he broke that silence and asked to be sent to Sable Hill. No one volunteered him. No one suggested it. But he arrived at the Archdiocese that morning with a suitcase, a flask of water, and a small crucifix carved from river bone. He placed it on the bishop's desk and said, "I have been called." He did not mean by the Abernathys, and he did not mean by God. The official record of his visitation was lost in the fire that consumed the Essex archives in 1819, but 4 letters survived, each sealed with wax, hidden behind a false panel in his study desk, discovered almost 50 years later. After his death, the first letter is dated the night before his journey. "I have dreamt of corridors that loop, not physically, but morally. Every step forward feels earned, but each turn brings me back to my own reflection. I believe I am being watched by the self I have not yet become, and I do not like what I see." He arrived at Sable Hill at sunrise. The ground was damp. The grass snapped beneath his boots like straw. No smoke came from the chimney. No birds moved above the roofline, but the door was open, just a crack, not enough to invite, just enough to see that someone was already waiting. The Abernathys did not greet him, not in the usual sense. He stepped inside and was met with silence. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of anticipation. His second letter, written the next day, reveals the first fracture. There is a painting near the foyer, a pastoral scene, sheep, clouds, sun. But when I walked past it again, the sun was missing. The sheep were thinner. I watched the frame, and it changed. The walls seemed to breathe. They expand slightly with the candles, not outward, inward, like the house is remembering how full it once was. He describes the family only. Briefly, they are not unkind, but they are convinced. They do not speak unless spoken to, and even then, their answers feel practiced. I asked where the chapel was. Clara said, "Which one?" She smiled, but her eyes did not. On the third day, he found the mirror. It stood in a hallway with no corners. 7 feet tall. Brass frame. Veil. He lifted the veil and saw something he would not describe. Only this: it does not show your past. It shows what you will do if you choose not to stop. Later that night, he heard movement behind the walls. Small feet. A breath that did not end. A cough, like a laugh forced backward. And then, silence. His third letter, shakier in ink, is dated October 5th. They have a second chapel. Not on the first floor, not even underground. It is ... behind. You do not find it. You accept it. You submit, and it appears. There are no pews, just steps. 7, descending in a spiral, but not into earth. Into air that is thicker than soil. The walls are made of salt. I tasted it. He goes on. There is an altar, but no cross. Instead, a frame, empty, like something was removed or fled. The girl stood beside me. I did not hear her approach. She asked me why God allows hunger. I gave her the answer they taught us. She said, "That's not the answer the house gave me. No signature. just the imprint of the crucifix pressed into the page. 2 days later, he returned, but he did not return whole. Witnesses say he walked back to the parish barefoot, his eyes bloodshot, his robe unfastened, and in his hands, the small riverbone cross, broken, the top half missing. He spoke no words, not to his brothers, not to his bishop, only one phrase, overheard in the dead of night as he stared into the chapel's votive flames. The silence in that house does not wait. It chooses. Then he locked himself in his study for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th, he was found, nailed to the study wall, arms spread, feet crossed, crucified. There was no blood, no wound, only ash. His mouth had been packed with it. Same wood ash found in the Abernathy chapel decades before. The walls of the study were untouched, except for one word scratched into the paint with his own fingernail. Miravi, Latin. It does not translate cleanly, but roughly, I was seen. No one could explain how he managed the act alone. No ladder. No tools. No sign of entry or struggle. His journal had been burned. Only the letters remained. And one note, written on the final page of a hymnal, hidden beneath his floorboards. There is a chapel where God does not listen, but something else does. After that, no one was sent to the house. Not clergy, not law, not family, because they had all read the letters. And in them, they saw something deeper than fear. They saw conviction, the kind that doesn't fade, not the kind that waits. And the house on Holloway Sable Hill still waits. In the root cellar beneath the east wing, the floor was not made of stone. It looked like stone, felt like it, but when struck, it didn't echo. It absorbed sound. And beneath that silence, if you listened closely, there was movement, slow, rhythmic, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to the living or the dead, only to the process between. Micah Abernathy was the youngest child of the final generation, born during the famine, raised in the shadow of the house's silence. And unlike his sisters, who disappeared into ritual, or his brothers, who were never named, Micah wrote. He recorded everything. And in 1814, 1 year after the death of Father Albinus, a collection of notebooks was discovered buried beneath the hearth, sealed in wax, bound in blackened linen, pages stitched with horsehair and some kind of resin. They would become known as the Doctrine of Worms. Not because of their condition, but because of what they described. The notebooks weren't sermons, not prayers, not confessions. They were instructions. Micah wrote in clean, deliberate script, precise spacing, sparse punctuation. His tone was not frenzied or manic. It was calm. Almost medical. The body is the veil, he writes, and the veil must rot before the voice behind it is heard. He describes the soul not as a gift, but a seed buried within the flesh, nourished only when the body decays while still aware. He calls it transcendent fermentation, a sacred process, a reversal of sign. And the first step, he writes, is acquisition, not of knowledge. Of material, living rot, flesh, that moves without pulse. Worms. Maggots. Skin, softened by mildew and marrow, unmoored from bone. It is not death that brings us closer to it, he continues, but digestion. Let the new priest eat the old tongue. Let him swallow the softened teeth, and he will hear it sing from beneath the cellar floor. The notebooks describe rituals, 3 major sacraments, all of them involving ingestion. The first, the meal of collapse, a solitary practice. The initiate places his future self, written in detail on vellum, into a dish made from earth and bone. He then covers it in whatever spoils, naturally within 7 days. Spoiled milk, rotten, fruit. Carrion. The document must be consumed in full. Only when your future dies in your stomach, Micah writes, can your past begin to speak. The second rite, the cup of unbirth, a hollowed chalice, filled with standing rainwater, crushed moths, and ash scraped from the mouth of a fasting child. No explanation is given, only that it must be drunk in silence. during a solar eclipse. Do not thank it. Do not fear it. It remembers your throat. The final ritual, the most detailed, is the worming. The initiate lies supine, beneath an open wound in the ceiling, a hole, not from construction, but from the house itself, formed naturally through decades of moisture, decay, and rot. Worms are placed upon the skin. Live. They are allowed to crawl, and only those that choose to enter the mouth may be eaten. Micah refers to them as letters. Each is a word. Each word is a wound. Each wound will spell your new name. And it is in this context that his writings shift. Theology gives way to memory. He begins to recount dreams. One, in particular, recurs across 3 separate entries. Hallway of mirrors. But none of the reflections are his own. Each mirror shows someone else. A woman in a collarbone-length veil. A child with a tongue of nails. A priest covered in ash. He writes that the hallway narrows with each mirror until it becomes so thin he has to turn sideways to continue. And at the end is a door made of teeth. He never opens it, but he hears what's behind it. A low sound, he says, like the memory of music, like the echo of a birth that never finished. He begins fasting, longer and longer each time. At one point, he claims he went 19 days without speech, and that by the end, his saliva had turned bitter and black. He called it pre-language. And this is where the journal changes tone. The final notebook is thinner. Stains obscure most of the writing, but one passage remains. It is not a god. It is not a demon. It is not waiting. It is fed. It is becoming. It is already here, but we are not yet ready to open it. Our mouths are still too clean, our stomachs too proud, so we rot, we swallow, we kneel, and we will hear it through our own skin. The last page is blank. Except for a single phrase, scratched faintly into the corner in reversed script, only legible when viewed in the mirror. It lives in the pit where the Eucharist won't go. After this, Micah disappears from all remaining records. No burial. No obituary. Only one rumor survives, passed through 3 generations of caretakers at St. Lyle's, that beneath the southern crypt, there was once a locked room. And inside it, a well, covered in wax. And filled with worms. The caretaker who first found it described it simply, it smelled like meat, but not bad, not rotten, like something that had already passed through someone. The room was sealed in 1823, but the worms returned. In the margins of hymnals. In the mouths of dead birds. In the cracks of every mirror in the Abernathy home. And on the walls of the cellar, drawn in wax, was the first line of Micah's doctrine. The veil must rot. And the veil was everywhere. The wood of the house cracked long before the fire reached it. For weeks, villagers had heard it at night, a soft popping noise, like knuckles flexing, boards expanding, beams loosening without wind or weight. One by one, the shutters began to hang loose. Nails pulled themselves free without splinters. And still, no one moved inside. No candlelight. No chanting. Just a growing sense that the house was waiting. By the spring of 1866, the hill had gone dark. Overgrown. Brittle. Grass. Dead trees. Hollow soil. Children were forbidden from approaching, but still returned with pockets of wax and dead flies. Dogs barked at the slope. Crows circled once, then flew wide. And then the boy went missing. 10 years old. Last seen heading home from the mill. His cap was found on the path leading to Sable Hill, and a trail of ash vine, dry, colorless, led up to the house. No body, no blood, no call for ransom. Just the cap, the ash, and the silence. That night, a decision was made. Not in words, not in meeting, but in glances. In the way the butcher locked his doors early. In the way the deacon held the hymn book upside down. In the way the baker turned the oven off before sunrise. The house had taken, and the town would take. Back. By TORCHL, IGT. At 3:12 a.m., 7 men climbed Sable Hill with oil, kindling, and iron bars. they did not speak. One of them, Ezekiel Mars, had once built coffins. Another, Caleb Rowe, had buried 2 sons. Each man brought something sacred: crucifix, a Bible, a locket filled with hair, rags soaked in holy water. They formed a circle around the base of the home, poured oil at each threshold, pressed symbols into the dirt, waited for the wind to turn. And when it did, they lit the fire. It caught fast. Too fast. The flames moved as if already inside the walls. Windows cracked outward, paint curled and peeled like skin. The porch buckled inward. The siding turned black, then peeled in perfect sheets. But the house did not fall, and the fire didn't rise. It sank. One by one. The flames turned down, not down the walls into them, into the floorboards, into the soil, beneath the foundation. And the screaming started, not from the house, from the ground. Ezekiel described it in his final journal entry. It weren't the kind of scream you hear with ears. It was under the ribs, like the soil had lungs, like the hill itself was sucking air between its teeth. He dropped his torch and ran. Only 3 of the 7 made it back down. 1 stumbled blind into the river. Another vomited blood. Ezekiel walked home, sat on his porch, and didn't sleep again for the rest of his life. He would later tell his daughter, "Fire don't destroy that house. It feeds it. Same way, a mouth don't burn when it eats bread." When the town returned at first light, the house was still standing. The walls were black. Charred. Hollow. But the foundation was untouched, not scorched, not cracked. Clean. As though it had been waiting for the fire. And then came the fog. It rolled in from nowhere. No humidity, no storm. Just a thick wall of mist that poured down the hill and swept across the cemetery behind. St. Lyle's. By noon, the grave markers had begun to shift, not tip, not sink. Shift. As though the coffins beneath had moved. Later that day, mourners arriving for a funeral found a child's grave. Open. Not dug up, not collapsed. Open. The coffin lid was propped neatly to one side. Inside was a bed of dry soil. No body, just folded clothes and a doll made of salt. By nightfall, the fog had settled into the root systems of every tree in the valley. People claimed their wells tasted sour, that their shadows came late, and that candles no longer flickered, even in wind. When officials came from Boston to investigate, the townspeople said it had been a barn. Fire. Nothing more. They did not mention the boy. They did not mention the scream, and no one dared return to the house, except the undertaker. He went alone, said he wanted to check the foundation for burial. Integrity. He returned pale. Eyes bloodshot, toe. Hands trembling. When asked what he saw, he answered simply, "The steps go down now." They asked what he meant. He didn't reply. That night, he hanged himself from the belfry, but not before writing one sentence into the dust on his parlor mirror. We woke it up, and it's still chewing. After that, the town kept their distance. The grass around the house refused to grow. Birds flew around the hill, even in migration. And the fog never fully lifted from the cemetery. 1 year later, during a drought, a fire broke out in the mill house 2 miles away. It spread across the valley. Fields burned, homes collapsed, but when it reached the edge of Sable Hill, it stopped. Abruptly. As if held back. As if the land itself had drawn a line, and the soil was still warm. The window pane in the upper west room had not been cleaned in over a century, and yet, in the final known photograph of the Abernathy house, taken in 1949, it glints, a sliver of reflected light, a human shape, faint, white, unmoving, just behind the glass. According to town records, the woman seen in the photo had died in 1907. Her name was Miriam Abernathy. She was buried without ceremony. No autopsy, no obituary. And yet, there she stands, 42 years later, with her hands folded, eyes hollow, watching the man who would later burn the negative. But he didn't burn the print. because prints don't bleed, and his did. It began with minor discoloration, faint smears across the lower border, grayish at first, then red, and rust-dark dotted. Smelled like earth after rain. And something older than that. Something kept. The photographer, Jonas Elm, mailed the picture to a friend at the Massachusetts Historical Registry, asked him to verify exposure inconsistencies. The package arrived opened. The envelope torn, and the photo gone. In its place was a single index card. Return address. Just 2 words, typewritten in all caps. Stop asking. By 1952, all attempts to catalog the Abernathy property had been blocked. Permits were denied, access revoked, maps redrawn to omit the hill entirely, not erased, not deleted. Just looped, so that the road appeared to continue but led nowhere. The same way the mirrors in the house reflected places that never existed. The same way Father Albinus described the chapel below as spiraling into air. The town clerk resigned in 1954. No explanation. He left his office unlocked. Files untouched. Except one drawer now empty, where all Abernathy birth and death records had once been kept. He was found 2 weeks later in a motel bathtub 300 miles south. The water was full of salt. The tub was dry. By 1961, the state began to digitize psychiatric records. Abernathy descendants had been institutionalized quietly over the years. 4 known cases, all unrelated by immediate bloodline, but traced back to the family by last name or estate ownership. Their records were never digitized. Instead, they were sealed. Indefinitely. A Freedom of Information request, filed in 1982, was returned with a single-stamped denial, not subject to public review, per Order 237B. No such order exists in the Massachusetts State Charter, and no department claimed to have issued it. 1. Investigator Dr. Helen Murney spent 11 years tracking Abernathy lineage through medical side notes and abandoned census data. She traced the last living relative to a home for the blind in Albany. He refused to speak, but he did write. He gave her a single page, folded into quarters. The paper was brittle, smelled faintly of oil. The writing, uneven, shaky. Read. I didn't go blind. I closed my eyes. They said it only comes in when you're seen. Helen submitted her findings to the Diocese of Boston. They declined comment, but 2 weeks later, Bishop John Remington stepped down. Citing exhaustion of purpose. He was 5'4", healthy, privately devout. When asked by reporters, he only said, "There are houses the church cannot enter. Even Christ left some doors shut." A week later, he vanished during a silent retreat in rural Maine. All that was found in his quarters was a single torn page from an unnumbered Bible, stuck inside the Book of Psalms. The verse was underlined in charcoal. Though the mouth be closed, it still devours. Across the bottom, 3 letters had been burned into the page with a match. The W.C. Abernathy Worming Chapel. The term does not appear in any known theological catalog, but it is referenced in a memo from the 1976 Internal Review of Obscure Heresies. Memo which was never intended for publication. One line appears, repeated 6 times. They fed the house. The house remembered. The house remembers us. Since then, every official attempt to approach the property has ended in redirection. Surveyors sent to map the land, report corrupted equipment, compass needles that spin, photographs that fade, drone footage that cuts to static and returns with the timestamp erased. And always, in the corner of every shot, a window. Smudged. But not empty. In 2004, a private researcher attempted LiDAR scans of the substructure. The scans returned malformed. Warped. No recognizable architecture, only patterns, repeating glyphs in the density map, not symbols of any known script, but organic loops, like bone, cross-sections, like mouths, like the inside of a wrist. They terminated the project and sold the data. The buyer? An anonymous foundation located in Vatican Hill. In 2016, a journalist published a short article about the Abernathy disappearance. Within 2 weeks, the paper shut down. The article was pulled offline. The journalist moved overseas. But in the web, archives cached metadata. One sentence survived. She was still at the window when I left. She hadn't aged. No one claims authorship of that line. No one knows who wrote it. But the photo, the final known image of the Abernathy home, faded, grainy, monochrome, still exists. In private circles, traded among collectors. Woman. Veiled. Eyes downcast, lips slightly parted, and behind her, the faint impression of another face. Not quite formed, pressed into the glass like condensation. It is not clear, but it is human. Or once was. No public archive will admit to possessing the print. No modern agency acknowledges its authenticity, but those who've seen it describe the same feeling, that you were not looking at the house. The house was looking through you, and the woman in the window? She wasn't posing. She was waiting. The chimney had collapsed inward, but the bricks were warm. Not from sunlight. There hadn't been any that day. But from something below. When they crossed the threshold, the air felt thinner, like walking into a cathedral sealed for centuries. There was no rot, no mold, no dust. Silence, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind of silence that seemed to watch you. They were urban explorers. 4 of them. Amateur historians. Students. They entered the ruins of the Abernathy home on a dare. Not out of bravery, out of boredom. One carried a handheld camcorder. Another, a voice recorder and old maps from a regional archive. The house had been officially condemned in 1969, but foundations still remained. Scorched walls, decayed floors, and an uneven lattice of doorways leading to nowhere. The explorers noted that the structure didn't match the layout they had studied. Rooms were wrong. Hallways turned where they shouldn't. A stairwell led up. One floor, then down again without changing elevation. And there was one room that didn't have a door. They didn't find it. It found them. It was behind the kitchen, beneath a frame of blackened beams, tucked behind insulation too modern for the home's last known renovation. They found it because one of them fell through. Floorboard gave. He dropped 10 feet, landed on all fours. No injuries, but he didn't move. The others called to him. He turned, smiled. Then said nothing. When they lowered the camera into the space, the image stuttered. Lines appeared across the frame. Colors flattened, and there was no sense of shape, only flatness. The room was square, then hexagonal, then oval. And not a room at all. They said the walls didn't connect, corners didn't meet, surfaces rippled, slightly like fabric, but never moved. When one of them, Maria, stepped inside, her hair began to lift, not from wind, from something more like static. Or breath. The others followed, and the doorway was gone. Not sealed. Gone. They were inside. A space that had no entrance, no geometry. And no light source. But still, everything was visible. As if the walls themselves glowed. One explorer, Anthony the youngest, said he heard whispering. But not in the room. In his teeth. That when he pressed his tongue to his molars, the words came through. It's still eating. No one responded, because none of them heard the same thing. Maria heard her own voice, but younger, reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. Another David claimed the floor vibrated in time with his heartbeat, that it knew him. The footage captured inside the room is largely corrupted. Frames freeze. Time codes vanish. The image distorts and returns, but one segment remains intact. 12 seconds long. The camera, aimed at a blank wall, begins to sag, the floor bending in ways that should be impossible. Then a voice, not attached to anyone in frame, speaks clearly. You brought light into its stomach. No one remembers hearing it at the time, only in playback. The next moments are unclear. Maria begins to speak, but not in English. Not in any known language, and her eyes remain fixed forward, unblinking. David moves to leave, but turns the wrong way. There was no exit, dot just more room, and more of not a room dot space continued where it SOULDN single quotes T dot walls folded in and out like the surface of a lake, depth and reflection. Changing with every step, Anthony began repeating a single word over and over back. But each time it sounded different dot first, with fear dot, then with awe dot, then in reverse. He dropped the camcorder dot. It kept recording dot. What followed next is only known through witness testimony. David emerged first. He was found outside the house, barefoot, with mud on his lips and hair soaked in what appeared to be ink. He could not explain how he exited, only said, "There are corners that take. I was almost one of them." Maria came out 2 days later. She was found walking beside a river 12 miles west, clothes dry, hands raw, and speaking backward dot every word, consistently, fluently. Her tongue had partially fused to the roof of her mouth. Medical staff were unable to reverse it. She has not spoken since. 1987. Anthony never left dot. No body was found dot. No signs of struggle dot. Just the camcorder and an indentation in the soil. His shape like he had been absorbed. When officials reviewed the footage, most was unusable dot. Static dot. Flickers dot. But at the very end, 7 minutes and 12 seconds in, a child's voice is heard. Not one of the explorers dot. Anthony. Not David. Not Maria. A child dot. Young. Calm. Male dot. It says only one thing. It's still eating. Then silence dot. Not digital silence. Not static dot. Just room dot. Endless. Geometrically incorrect room dot. In the years since, others have searched for the space dot. No one's found it. The ruins remain, and every layout of the house is now different from the last. Drawings don't match dot. Maps refuse alignment. Even topographical scans show conflicting elevation. Like the house itself changes shape. When UNOBSERVED dot. The room without walls is still there, but not where you left it, because it does not. Stay dot. It waits dot. And when you forget to look away, it feeds again dot. In winter, the ground reflects no light, just a sheet of pale dust, fine as ash, but crystalline dot. Where the Abernathy house once stood, there is now only salt, not scattered, not spilled dot. Formed dot. As if it had risen from underneath, bled through the soil, and settled in a pattern no one can read. New Carthage was abandoned. In 1987 dot. No official notice dot. No declared emergency. One day, residents were there, and the next, gone. Homes still furnished. Lawns half mowed. Food left uneaten on plates. Even the clocks were frozen. Most around 3:07 a.m. One house, closest to Sable Hill, was found with its entire floor coated in candle wax. Not dripped. Poured dot. Windows. Sealed dot. Chairs overturned dot. And in the basement, a single table set for 7. Each plate filled with ash dot. No footprints dot. No fingerprints. But the salt was already there dot. Fine and dense. Packed into the corners of every room like insulation. Swept into circles. Piled behind doors dot. As if it had been carried dot. By hand, or by something that used hands once dot. No birds fly over New Carthage now. Not even crows. Migration paths curve around it. A local wildlife study in 1991 noted a persistent avian void over a 1.4 square mile radius. They blamed magnetic interference, but no instruments registered anything unusual. Only absence dot. Of motion, of echo, of color. If you speak above a whisper on the hill, your voice doesn't come back. No reverb dot. Just disappearance dot. Like the sound goes inward, not into air, but into space dot. One visitor described it as praying into a throat, but not a human one. A surveyor in 1993 brought a metal detector to map what he thought might be. Old cistern beneath the foundations dot. The signal shorted after 13 minutes, and the salt turned wet. He returned the next morning dot. Found his boot prints perfectly preserved in the surface, as if it had hardened into crystal, but the left ones were missing. Only right foot steps. No drag, no disturbance dot. Like something had followed him. Home but only halfway. When asked later, he said, "I think I brought something back. It wants to remember the rest of the steps." The church, when questioned, denies the Abernathy Estate ever existed. Their archives list no property, no family, no consecrated land in the area. And yet, in the Vatican's internal ledger, handwritten in Latin, there is a single line beneath: unresolved sites of theological distortion. It reads, Domus Abernathy, locus silenti, non tangere. The Abernathy House, place of silence. Do not touch. The entry is UNUMBERED. It has no cross-reference, and the page is glued to the binding, as if it were never meant to be turned. But people do return. Not locals, not descendants, not others, quiet. Pilgrims, scholars, cartographers, paranormalists. They don't come for answers. They come for the sound, because on certain winter nights, if the wind moves right and the clouds stay low, you can still hear it. 7 knocks, not loud, not fast, spaced, like ritual, like someone or something, still marking time from inside the earth. No echo, just rhythm. And when it ends, the air feels thinner, colder, and sometimes the candles light, no flame, no match. They just glow, one after the other, 7 wicks. 7 points of light, the same number as the rooms, the same number as the altars, the same number as the sisters, and for a moment, the salt glistens red, not wet, not blood, memory, some say it's the heat from the ground, some say it's phosphorescence from chemical decay, but no geologist will take samples, because salt doesn't grow upward, it doesn't hold shape like bone, it doesn't shift overnight, and it doesn't speak. But one visitor, a linguist from Lisbon, brought a white noise microphone, just to test the wind, just to listen. He left it recording for 8 hours unattended. When he reviewed the tape, most of it was static, but at 3:07 a.m., the pitch changed, soft, layered, a whisper beneath the hiss. He reversed the audio, slowed it down, cleaned the signal, and underneath, a voice emerged, childlike, male, speaking clearly. It doesn't stop when they leave. It only stops when they forget. Then 7 knocks, then silence. Not digital silence, not tape. His just room, again, like the one in the house, like the one without walls. The visitor didn't return. He deleted the file, destroyed the recorder, moved out of his apartment, left no forwarding address. But someone found the transcript on a public library printer. Weeks later, just 1 page, no heading, just a single paragraph. Last line reads, "It is not the house that remembers. It is the silence, and it is waiting to be filled again." And beneath it, smudged fingerprints, salt, lined, faint, and still warm.